Liberal arts, it's useful to think about where liberal arts began. Because liberal arts, as we know it today, is associated with a particular period of European history, which comes after the Great Enlightenment period in the 18th century, where there was a great deal of push to broaden the scope of what education might mean. If you think of European history at that time, and maybe here's some relevance for what the Indian situation, higher education was very dominated by religious institutions, and it was mainly young men from the privileged classes and the aristocracy who went to study. With liberal arts was an idea of making a curriculum that was more broad-based, not just based on theology, teaching Latin, but something that's secular, something that's broad-based, something that's accessible to every young, in this case, all young men of talent. This is how it begins, and then it goes through different phases, becomes very popular in the United States in the 20th century, where the big expansion in education happens, especially after World War II, where so many new colleges are opening up, and this liberal arts model becomes the dominant one. Precisely because it promises a sort of formation of the mind. In many ways, the key to liberal arts is the notion of self-cultivation. You have to cultivate, you have to expand yourself, be able to think for yourself with autonomy, make decisions for yourself. You have to have enough knowledge, but also kind of idea values that you can actually make qualified decisions. So in it, there is a sort of also almost an assumption that you get trained to become a better citizen. So the idea of sending people to college is not just, of course, in America, and I'll come to India in a minute, is of course you can get a better job and you can attain some kind of higher status or maybe social mobility and improve your own situation in life. But at the heart of it, the philosophy of it, is really about creating a different kind of citizen, a more enlightened, self-reliant, autonomous kind of citizen. Now, today, if you look at India, the liberal arts model has come to India partly because many Indian students have gone to the US in the last 30 years. It used to be that people went to the UK for higher education. Now US has become the preferred destination the last 30, 40 years. And there people have encountered the liberal arts model. So that many people wanted to have a version of that in India. The question is, and I'm not sure how that's going to be worked out in different institutions, is that you say liberal arts, yes, but what is it, how are we going to work out a curriculum that honors some of the basic assumptions about liberal arts, which is still expand your mind, attain some form of personal and intellectual autonomy, learn to think critically for yourself. Don't let other people tell you what to think, right? Develop critical faculties, all these things, so you can become a better professional in your profession, but also a better citizen of India. So liberal arts is, in its conception, anti-hierarchical, right? It's based on a principle of equality, merit, and secular values, right? As it's not difficult, given where India is today, it's not difficult to see that some of this, implementing some of this, might rub against some sentiments in Indian society. So when you work in America, in an American institution, and you tell parents who come, and they're paying a lot of money to send their kids to college, and if they're of a more conservative disposition, they often ask, so what is this liberal arts? Because in America, liberal means that you are somewhat left of center politically. In India, it doesn't mean the same thing. But I always say to parents, well, it means that we teach your child how to think for himself, herself. right? And for some parents, that's good. For other parents, not so much, right? And I think that's one of the big questions that will come in India also, that now I think liberal arts has a certain prestige because of the quality of the institutions that are being opened. But I think the question of the actual content of what is being taught and the consequences of that and what that does to the way in which people see themselves and see Indian society, I think that is yet to be seen. In Europe, there's been two different things happening. So the way liberal arts was taught, let's say in the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, was often around teaching of the classics. You had to know something about Greek and Roman history. You had to know something about sort of Western civilization. After World War II, many countries in Europe had sort of more left of center governments, social democratic, socialist governments. And there was a push against liberal arts because they said, oh, this is elitist. This is like the bourgeois class, the values of them. You know, why do we have to learn Latin? Why do I have to learn all this stuff about the Greeks? That's not necessary. I just want to be an engineer, get a job, that's it, right? So a lot of that was a more, you can say, utilitarian attitude. That education was seen as a means to an end, right? A means to improve yourself, get a better economy, so on and so forth. But all this other stuff about developing the mind and all that, they were less interested in that. And they actually had a big influence. And so liberal arts almost in its older form almost disappeared. Now it's coming back in various ways, but it's still contested because even in the US it's also contested. This whole question of in many colleges in the US and in Europe, there is like many students are saying, look, do we have to take these courses in Western civilization? Many students come from other ethnic backgrounds. Some are Muslim, some are from South Asia, some are from Africa, some are, maybe second generation immigrants. They say, can we not think of civilization beyond the Western canon? Can we not think of it as something that's more global? So all these questions are being wrestled with. So it's still in flux. No, I think it's in its formative years in India, and not just in India, but also in Southeast Asia, Singapore, Pakistan, and in Middle East. I think the real conversation about liberal arts is between two visions of what it could be. One is a kind of return to the classics. Many American conservatives in Europe are saying we have to return to the Greek, to the Romans, to the Latin, to Western civilization, to basic values and that kind of thing that has made Europe and America what they are. The progressives are saying, no, we have to think of liberal arts education as on a global scale. We now live in an interconnected world. There are many civilizations in the world. We cannot just draw from one. We have to learn about the world in its fullness. So that's the conversation going, right? In India, I'm not sure where, but I think they're both sides of this debate. And I find that interesting. So on one hand, you would have, I know at Ashoka University, they have a course in Indian civilization. And even that, the content of that is quite contested because, as you know, the government of the day in this country are also very busy promoting Indian civilization, but it means different things to different people, right? And Indian civilization is a complicated thing. Even say Hindu civilization, you say, what kind of Hindu are you talking about, right? And if you say Hindu, you automatically exclude a very large proportion of the Indian population of the country, right? So what does it mean? What is Indian civilization? It's not just Hindu, it's also other sources. And even the question of who is a Hindu is a complicated one, and how you are. So I don't think that conversation has quite it hasn't reached any conclusion. It's not yet a public debate. It might become. it might become in the future in the public sphere. But, so far I think most of the liberal arts institutions in India have avoided becoming involved in political fights over its curriculum. It might happen in the future. So I don't think they're contradictory. I think the fact that Gandhi devoted much thought and action to nonviolence was precisely that he understood that he lived in a society, also at the time of his time, where the potential for great violence was ever present. He was thinking about how to do mass politics of a new kind, right? When he was sitting in South Africa and inventing these new forms of action, protest against the colonial state, he knew that he was up against an overwhelming power. He also knew that the society in which he operated, and even more so when he came to India after 1915, that India was riven with many kinds of conflicts, and that creating a popular, mobilizing people to participate and ask for their rights and participate in politics in a new, active way would generate and activate many of these conflicts. So his conundrum was, how do I create a mass movement that doesn't turn into mass violence, right? So if you think of Gandhi's career, most of his famous actions, all his famous fasts, many of his most famous public acts were attempts at reducing or quelling or bringing to an end forms of violence that have happened. Think of the great violence that unfolded in Calcutta in the 1940s, where Muslims and Hindus killed each other in very large numbers. He went straight into Calcutta and began a fast, right? To death. And then they stopped, right? So many of his famous actions like that were to stop the violence. So for me, the argument of the book is that the possibility of mass violence on a major scale is the very condition that leads Gandhi to think about nonviolence, right? It's not because India is a nonviolent society. It's quite the other way around. It's because in India, there is this because of the many conflicts and because of the divided character of Indian society, violence is an ever-present possibility, right? That's why a philosophy of nonviolence had to be devised in order to, in a sense, manage that. That's how I look at it.